Hello, everybody, and welcome to our live today. We will be joined by Fay today, who will be talking about the Thai protests, especially those that have been happening in the past few months. She currently lives in Thailand and she is a Thai native as well, and she has grown up there. And today we will be asking the current socio-political background of the issue, along with what started it, why the whole protests began. So join us to listen to what she has to say today. So a little bit about who we are. Wait a minute. Okay, let's just solution. We interview a lot of young people, especially about different social and political topics. Cool. All right. Hi, Faye.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. You?
I am doing good, yeah.
That's good. All right. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Obviously my name is Fay. I'm 17 and I attend an international school in Bangkok. And I've been like following politics in Thailand relatively close, I'd say. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So today I just briefly said that we're talking about the Thai protests, but do you want to go a little deeper and maybe mention what's been happening recently and a little bit about their background?
The protest I believe kind of began um like summer of 2020. So kind of during, like the COVID after the COVID lockdown, because the cases in Thailand were kind of um, what's it called, like decreasing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess like it was just an accumulation of people being dissatisfied with the government and what like kind of what wasn't changing in the country. And of course, like we know about the rigged election in the I think it was the 2020 or 2019 election. And of course, people weren't happy about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they're out here to protest for change, and especially the three demands that they're looking for, which is for free speech, making like criticism against the government legal, and for people not to face repercussions of that, and also to redraft like a new constitution and to dissolve the current House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm. So can you give us a little bit of like a background overall of what
Right.
type of political system Thailand follows and what the political climate it is there?
hmm Yeah, sure. Again, Thailand kind of claims itself as a constitutional democracy, but of course, we kind of know that it isn't. And the current prime minister actually rose to power from a coup. So that just makes kind of the political system right now a dictatorship. And so people are kind of protesting against that. And of course, a coup is illegal. And again, if you orchestrate a coup, then you will face repercussions. And, um, yeah, I don't know. But because he's in charge of the law currently, that's kind of why, he's able to, I guess, escape from that. But yeah, it's supposed to be a constitutional monarchy. However, the reality isn't that, and it instead a dictator, where there's an authoritarian government ruling Thailand right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about the monarchy and how Thailand follows a constitutional monarchy, but how much, social respect or, this idea of the royalty being, quite almighty, what is that kind of sense there in Thailand?
If you've seen the news on like the protests, a lot of it has been around kind of the monarchy and them wanting to reform the monarchical institution. And the monarchy is very highly revered, very respected here because of like just the intertwining history between Thailand and the monarchy and how it's been here for so long. And such a system that's ingrained in Thailand. And all of the, I guess, power dynamics and structures of Thailand is quite centered around the monarchy, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
always have this sort of power. So kind of to speak up or speak even against them is deemed as something that's just unspeakable of, and that's what we're trying to change, I guess, in terms of like the people coming out to protest and not getting arrested for just speaking about the monarchy. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So you refer to those that engage in the protests as like we, or but it seems like it's more of like a younger generation of people. But why do you think it's more of a younger generation rather than an older generation? And what's the, difference in perception between the two generations?
So I do think there is like a percentage of people who aren't only like young people or older people. Of course, the younger generation are kind of here to speak out about that. I mean, I personally kind of have conversations like with my dad or like with my family, and I can definitely see how I guess as youth and like young people, I feel like we're just more inclined to speak about stuff, but also kind of like the older generation, they've kind of seen the repercussions that people have to dealt with as a result of kind of speaking about the monarchy or speaking against them. So I guess there's just this like very widespread fear around speaking about it, and so hence that's why older generations don't really talk about it. But I don't know, I guess it's also the age of social media and digital media. Like people, things just spread like very quickly, of course, and now the young people coming out, right, and they post these things on social media, and then people around the world are able to see that, so they're not like completely alone in all of this, I guess. So that's why young people are more inclined to, yeah,
Yeah.
participate.
Hmm. Also, just like in general, I think 2020 was a year of a lot of protests. It was from, the Hong Kong protests that I can't even believe that it was that was in 2020, because 2020 was such an eventful year. But along with that, there was obviously the Black Lives Matter movement that happened honestly like throughout the world, and then there's like the Thai protests. So I think 2020 was, as you said earlier, it's this moment of reflecting and this idea of you're protesting, like you're not alone in this movement. So yeah, that was really interesting. But you living in Thailand, did you have like any personal impact, like the protests, did they have any impact on your daily life?
Hmm. So in terms of my daily life, I wouldn't say there's I mean, I think for sure, I think the media coverage has like quite shifted a lot in terms of just what they're covering, and also I guess like just the political conversation in general. And of course, people have been partaking in protests a lot. There's also actually been a change in several laws, and this isn't about the monarchy, but it's about kind of the young people and the youth coming out to talk about these uniform reforms, how there should be, reforms around uniforms, and that has actually happened. So I do actually believe that, they do have a voice to um, change what's currently kind of, the system right now.
Mm-hmm. So So in terms of the social climate of Thailand, like we talked earlier a little bit, like yesterday, I think, about systemic inequalities and stuff like that in Thailand. And I just wanted to address that. But would you like to explore a little bit more about, the gender inequalities or some other things like that?
Yeah, so I feel like the reason I kind of was interested in politics in the first place was more so because like um I'd say kind of things happening in my own home and kind of my household, and seeing like notions and ideas of like rape culture being perpetuated. And so I feel like that kind of sparked the idea of how that was just the bigger issue, which was this system, that's kind of built upon patronage, and how like, the people in power are usually men,
Hmm.
older men, older generation, I guess. So that's kind of how I became interested. And if I wanted to solve this issue of systemic inequality, I had to, I guess, look at it from the system and like how the system would pursue.
That's really interesting. So you said a little bit about, gender inequality within Thailand and what you saw yourself in your own personal life and, everything just around you. But so I understand that, there's inequality between genders, but like how does this, relate to that political climate? And I guess, yeah, how does it all relate with the social concepts or the constructs as well as the political constructs and this idea of inequality?
Yeah, so I guess yeah, so in regards to gender, there was recently protests where this woman she came out and talked about like the sexual misconduct schools and um and yeah, she had actually a lot of back for some reason. Again, like I'm not surprised just because of people's attitudes around that. And that just shows how great um, the issue of patriarchy and just rape culture is so prevalent. Those people in charge. So I believe it was like a senator who actually kind of tried to file like an offense against that student because she just deemed it as like making false accusations. So I feel like that's just really problematic in the point where like even those in power just fail to acknowledge and recognize a problem, right? So that shows how like the system is very flawed and how they weren't even democratically elected because it wasn't a rigged election. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's really interesting with, how everything just kind of comes into the roots of how the system plays out. But going back to the origins, I guess, of the protest. So there's conflict between the royalty and the student protest, but also between those that support the royal family and the student protests as well. So there's, two clashes between the actual royalty and the royalty supporters. But could you comment on how deep and historic royalism just in general lies in Thailand? And yeah, how does that play a role into this conflict?
Yeah, so actually, so before the current prime minister actually kind of rose to power, he orchestrated a coup. So that coup was actually due to the red shirt and yellow shirt protests. And so the yellow shirt and red shirt protest is very like a protest that's very kind of centered around royalists and also people who wanted kind of a reform. So the red shirts were kind of Thaksin supporters. So the former prime minister at the time, so uh, were supporting him and kind of also supporting democracy and having monarchy above the law, not above the law, sorry, under the law and all of that. And the yellow shirt supporters were mainly royalists and people who had accused the prime minister of corruption. And so that clash really shows how royalists and people who aren't royalists do clash quite a lot. Now, in very privileged societies, also, also where I kind of live and where I grew up and where I go to school as well, there are, of course, royal supporters. But I guess because people don't really talk about it in terms of social settings, schools, maybe that doesn't cause a clash. However, in political protest, there definitely is that clash. So yeah.
Mhm. So that clash, and I think you like briefly mentioned it about what the demands of the younger generation were. So I just want to go and just tell me if I'm wrong, but it's, the resignation of the prime minister, if I'm not wrong. You mentioned like the new constitution to be drafted to have it more within democratic lines instead of, constitutional democracy, I think you mentioned. So, and the reformation of a powerful monarchy. But along with that, there's requirements and there's necessities, I guess, or demands of the student protests against the royalty. But could you maybe name a few of them? Maybe some that I haven't mentioned yet?
Sorry, name a few of like the demands in terms
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the. So
Or maybe the
so
dissatisfaction that the student protests have against the royalty itself.
oh, okay. So again, like kind of the resignation of. I mean, yeah, we kind of talked about the resignation of the prime minister. Um, and yeah, I think free speech is definitely something that's again, it's related to the monarchy, but it's something that's definitely been a very kind of demand by the protesters because if you've kind of seen the news around protests in Thailand, so many people have been arrested,
Mm-hmm.
and just because very just small, I guess, wrongdoings, like it's not even, kind of wrongdoings as defined by the law in Thailand, but basically kind of breaking the least majesty law. And so that's definitely been a very huge issue in kind of the number of arrests going up too, and especially in the midst of COVID, right? Like a pandemic, like people are still, I mean, the police are still arresting people and um, giving them very just brutal sentences for kind of speaking out about things that are actually happening and, expressing themselves. So I think this is definitely a big demand.
Mm-hmm. I think you also wrote an article about like how international schools also play a role into, local governments or local political clashes and stuff like that. And I think that's how I also found you. But could you maybe talk about how, us, like also personally, I go to an international school and I live in Belgium, but I'm not Belgian. But how do we relate to all of these different local movements and these political clashes? Mm-hmm.
Uh, right. So kind of like the real world importance why this should
Yeah.
matter. So I feel like again, like I don't think people actually really know about Thailand that much today, but also the fact that I guess kind of in hindsight, it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. It's not as extreme as obviously North Korea, like countries that are actually ruled by dictatorship. But I think it's still a very big deal, and it is a very big deal because it's kind of it kind of reminds me of 1984. I don't know if you know that book, right? The one about George Orwell's book, right? About kind of the futuristic dystopian world where people aren't able to consume media. So I feel like it's slowly going into that direction, even though it's not kind of that what's it called? Like it's not that obvious, I'd say, but I definitely feel like, people who are actually consuming media that's outside the government regulated media are starting to realize when they come out and even speak upon these issues, it's not, they get arrested and there's just negative repercussions to that. Also, the fact that Thailand is a developing country and it's been developing for many, many decades. And I think that part of the reason to why, you know, this kind of like Thailand's growth isn't really, going anywhere is probably also because of the present government and how it's ruled not by democracy, but by a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned a little bit about, how people don't really know much about Thailand. And honestly, personally, I kind of agree with you, especially because the media doesn't really portray a lot of things that are outside of the the Western world per se. But, there's a lot of dangers that come along with that. But maybe could you explore a little bit about what these like overall, like the of what the ignorance of not promoting or addressing these issues outside of the Western world could be.
So I guess it's like for any other country, really, right? Like, I mean, if there's a war, if there's any injustices going on outside, kind of the Western world, like it's still going on. And I guess like it's really difficult to explain why it's important, but then again, it's kind of also like saying why, stuff that's happening in the West is also important, aka kind of like, why Black Lives Matter is important or movements are important. So I feel like I would talk about it in terms of like if you don't really see the importance of the issue, then maybe like like then why do you see the importance in other issues like the Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement? I feel like it's definitely as important, and the only difference really is just kind of where it's going on. But I feel like all of these issues definitely have the same root cause in the fact that it's systemic and in terms of the real problem isn't an individual problem but a systemic problem. So yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of systemic, you're basically referring to the fact that, or like, I guess suggesting the idea that it was a long time coming. Like a lot of the times, these social movements happen because they've just been happening for a really long time. The same inequalities and the same dissatisfaction just kind of trail off for a really long time, and then it amounts to the point to where people begin to protest. And like, I guess I'm just kind of returning back to the other point, but you mentioned a little bit about, the difference in perspectives between the two generations, I guess, and how the student protests are mainly led, obviously, as the name suggests, students. So they're the younger generation. And you kind of mentioned about the difference in perspectives, but are there any compromise between these two ideals, or how does the current situation like look like in Thailand right now?
Right. So in my opinion, I feel like it's definitely kind of hard to come to a consensus, especially when the demands in the perspective of the royalists or the people in power seem very radical, very extreme, when in fact it's kind of the basis of democracy. And so it's definitely difficult. There was just this very I guess viral video that went out about like the monarchy, talking about how you know it's the land of compromising, which I personally disagree with because it isn't. And I feel like if there were to be any compromising happening, then I think that would start from democracy and from people having the rights to speak out. And if, in my opinion, just kind of this, kind of baseline of democracy doesn't happen, then I don't think there can be any compromising.
Mm-hmm. I also do a little bit of research from, the transition that happened from the current king in Thailand and the previous king in Thailand. And I also know that when the previous king, I cannot pronounce his name, so I'm not even going to try. But when he passed away in 2016, there was, a huge mourning, and he was a very respected king. And now people are basically questioning whether the current king should still, like, deserve their respect. So in between these two, what do you find is the socio-political difference of back then and today?
Uh, okay. Let me think how I should phrase. But I I think that they definitely have equal power, but I just think people's perspective on the two monarchs are definitely quite like pretty different to say the least. Um, However, I still do feel that kind of having the current monarchy in terms of just this current monarchical system in place is still inhibiting free speech and isn't actually democracy. And I know I'm kind of like swerving around the question, but I guess to answer your question, they're they're definitely different in terms of people's perspectives on them, and I guess how deeply revered one is.
Mhm.
But I think it isn't really kind of the fair use of power in regards to how I I would say that many monarchs do get political, and it's though they're not kind of supposed to. Some are kind of more subtle in terms of being more political, but it's still it's just not they're not under the law then if they're very political about things, right?
Mhm.
So if
Yeah.
that answer.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because personally, I don't, I haven't really lived in a country long enough that has a monarchical, well, yeah, well, it has strong, deep and rooted monarchical systems. So it's really interesting to learn more about, how the monarchy plays into account of the socio-political climate of the entire country and what kind of influences and why it's like a large driving factor of how the country runs. But overall, I guess this conflict just highlights a new era of royalty, and hierarchy, and maybe even order, and as you mentioned on several occasions, democracy as a whole. But for you personally, as an overarching Thai citizen and a Thai native as well, think will happen, and why do you think, how do you think the people or the royalty or whatever, all parties should respond to the current system or the current climate?
Right. So I mean, if they really do claim themselves to be a democratic like a constitutional democracy, then I definitely do feel that they should listen to the people. And I think essentially the land really just belongs to the people. And so I feel like people who should kind of be in charge should be the people, right? And so I feel
Mhm.
like kind of the entire country, um, because it belongs to the people, I think they definitely should listen to the people's demands. And I do think that they're as in like the people are reasonable, and these demands aren't something that they just kind of want, just something they want, but it's something that's just, again, been a very long rooted issue. And I think it's definitely time for people in power to listen to them, actually, respond to their demands. But of course, we do know that it's definitely not that easy, and all the political kind of stuff that's going on that I don't even know how I'm called,
Mhm.
like, enough to speak upon that. But if there is any real change, I do believe that international intervention might also kind of be a way to change what's going on right now. And I think, especially in the age of social media, and that's
Mhm.
attracted a lot of people. And even, I believe, Tammy Duckworth, who is an American senator, so U.S. senator, I think she did talk about this even. So I feel like kind of having that international pressure on the country can also um, help address this issue, right? And to help pressure the government so that there's actually tangible change that's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was doing the research as well, I realized that all these protests are also happening in Australia, I think, as well. So definitely with the international pressure, I understand, and I think that is, a relatively feasible way to at least come to a consensus on this issue. Anyways, I guess it's time to ask the viewers if anybody has a question overall. But is there anything you'd like to add to the current issue of Thai protests, Faye?
Yeah, so I guess like I feel like I'm definitely not the best source. So kind of researching yourself. Like I know that BBC is definitely a very good source for this. And also I think Thai Inquirer, so kind of the article, the organization I wrote for, and and what else? I think on YouTube there's definitely a lot of videos. There's this video, I think I shared you like some resources that's definitely very kind of useful on kind of educating yourself and kind of seeing the different perspectives, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
from sources that has covered this.
Yeah. Yeah. So all these resources that Faye originally sent me can be found on the Instagram account, and it's on like one of the sources, so I can just link that a bit again. But anyways, yes. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think it was a really interesting and very insightful interview, especially because, as I said earlier, I don't think a lot of people know about what's happening or what was happening in Thailand. So it was a great opportunity to get to talk to you and just know more about what's happening. Thank you so much for participating.
Oh, thank you for having me, I guess. But
Perfect.
yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, also, our next interview will be about the harm that comes from the stereotype of Italians being generalized as part of a mafia. So look forward to that, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Faye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.